I think it's really both appropriate and very important that we step back for a moment and reflect on what we've actually accomplished over the last 12-month period. Because without a very clear and honest measure of what we have achieved, it will make the tasks that are immediately before us seem almost insurmountable. If you go back about a year ago, Obama had just been reelected largely as the result of an absolutely abysmal and cowardly campaign by the Republicans. And Obama had made it clear that his intention was to accelerate the unitary executive dictatorship. In effect, his intention was to ignore Congress and rule as much as possible by executive decree. Obviously, there was a new Congress sworn in January of this year, and so we were back to the drawing board on Glass-Steagall. We had amassed a large number of members of Congress in the previous session who had signed on to the Glass-Steagall bill introduced into the 112th Congress by Marcy Kaptur and Walter Jones and Jim Moran and a few other people. But we had no idea going into January what was going to actually happen in the new Congress. And so one of the very, very first days that the 113th Congress convened, we had the Glass-Steagall bill reintroduced into the House, again by Marcy Kaptur and by Walter Jones. It was on one of the very, very first days when a member could submit new legislation. I think it was H.R. 129, so it was one of the very earliest bills that was submitted. We had no movement in the Senate, and we understood that to effectively push Glass-Steagall in Washington, we had to organize the entire country around the fight. And so over the course of 2013, we got somewhere in the range of 25 state legislatures to introduce Glass-Steagall resolutions. And in a number of cases, those resolutions passed either the lower or upper houses of these state legislatures, but the impact was enormous, to the point that by no later than April of this year, the big Wall Street banks recognized that the firewalls that they had constructed against any possibility of Glass-Steagall were beginning to break down. We know that we have the first sighting of Jamie Dimon, the CEO of J.P. Morgan Chase, in April, traveling down to Texas, meeting with Governor Perry, and threatening to pull 30,000 jobs out of the state of Texas if there was any receptivity among Texas members of Congress or the state legislature to Glass-Steagall. A few months later, we had the battle in Delaware, where, again, Wall Street, in its own name, out front, used strictly mafia tactics to try to stop momentum for the Glass-Steagall resolution coming to a vote in Delaware. In the early part of the summer, we had the National Conference of State Legislators showdown in Atlanta, where, again, strict hooligan tactics were used by lobbyists for the big banks, again, totally out front, totally in their own name. They have no response that they can make to Glass-Steagall other than to issue threats of pulling jobs out of various states if they show any indication of support. By the spring, we had, and I can tell you this was 100% the result of our effort. So we got Senator Harkin from Iowa to introduce a Glass-Steagall bill in the Senate, which broke another critical barrier, broke the logjam that basically had existed. And suddenly, with bills in both the House and the Senate, and with growing numbers of members of the House signing on, much of it because of the pressure they were feeling from back home in their districts and in their state legislatures, suddenly this became an even more serious proposition. In June, I believe it was June, we had the introduction of the second Glass-Steagall for the 21st Century bill, coming from people who had been telling us for 3 years that they were working on this. It was Maria Cantwell, John McCain, Elizabeth Warren, and Angus King. And now, in just the past 10 days, we've had the introduction of a second bill into the House of Representatives, again with Walter Jones as an initiating co-sponsor, and also with Congressman John Tierney from Massachusetts. And the language in that House bill is identical to the Senate bill that specifically itemizes the fact that commercial banks will be barred from derivatives trading, from proprietary trading, from dealing in swaps and other kinds of gambling operations. And so we've brought this battle to a critical point. Last week when the Volcker rules were issued, not only did they not succeed in breaking the momentum on behalf of Glass-Steagall, they intensified the momentum because anybody looking at the Volcker rules, of course it's only 71 pages, but there are 900 pages of commentaries that you have to read through to make any sense of them. So it was transparently obvious immediately that the Volcker rule was a sick joke, as we had said it was from the beginning. And it was the very day that the Volcker rules were approved by the 5 regulatory agencies that the Tierney-Jones bill was introduced. And we know that the intention behind doing it that day was to respond instantly to the fraud of the Volcker rules and to create momentum right away, even though it was obvious that we were going into the holiday recess and Congress won't be back until January 7th. The intent was there to build momentum. So in the Glass-Steagall fight, just to take that as one particular crucial flank, because that's a death knell for the oligarchical system. If we win Glass-Steagall in the United States, and we are extremely close to being able to achieve that, if we win that fight, then the system of oligarchical power is basically put to rest. They will try to come back, they'll scramble, they'll try to start a nuclear war if they can get away with it to stop it from being finalized. But that will represent a strategic death blow to the Anglo-Dutch system of oligarchical finance dominated in the United States by Wall Street. And they know it, and therefore they take every step that we take on this issue deadly serious. We know that the ABA is putting out a monthly tracking report on LPAC's progress on the Glass-Steagall front. So the enemy knows that we have drawn blood on the Glass-Steagall issue. We've also hit at another critical flank, namely the terrorist capability, the irregular warfare capability represented by the Anglo-Saudi imperial combination. We have been working nonstop for more than a decade on getting at the truth behind the 9/11 attack, that it was a British Saudi operation carried out on behalf of the Bush-Cheney forces to give them the basis for a drive for presidential dictatorship in the United States.
What you're going to get with a frustrated Bush administration, if it's determined to prevent itself from being opposed, its will, you're going to get crisis management, where members of the special warfare types of the secret government, the secret police teams and so forth, will set off provocations which will be used to bring about dictatorial powers into motion in the name of crisis management. You will have small wars set off in various parts of the world, which the Bush administration will respond to with crisis management methods of provocation. That's what you'll get. And that's what the problem is. And you have to face that. You've got to control this process now, while you still have the power to do so. Don't be like the dumb Germans, who after Hitler was appointed to the chancellorship in January 1933, sat back and say, no, we're going to defeat him at the next election. There was never a next election. It was just this ja vote for Hitler as dictator. Because
we knew about the 28 pages that had been suppressed by Bush that demonstrated the role of Saudi intelligence, of Prince Bandar, of the royal family as a whole in providing critical material support for the people who actually carried out the 9/11 attacks. This year we made some dramatic breakthroughs on that front. In the early summer, two members of Congress, Walter Jones and Frank Wolf, successfully completed a several-month battle with the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee and had an opportunity to read the 28 pages. They're sworn to secrecy about the content, but nevertheless, they came out of that and said that there is nothing in these 28 pages that justifies not releasing them to the American people. There's no danger about methods, sources, procedures, all of the kinds of things that usually justify classification. It was embarrassing as hell for Bush. It was basically a stunning indictment of the Saudi royal family. And if you followed the threads back to the Al-Yamama deal, it also demonstrated that the British are as much an enemy of the United States today as they were back at the time of the American Revolution, and that they too had a hand in supporting the networks that had carried out the 9/11 attacks. So where are we now? Very recently, Congressman Steve Lynch, a Democrat from Massachusetts, joined with Walter Jones in introducing a new resolution into the House, calling on President Obama to declassify the 28 pages, calling on every member of Congress to basically go in and read the 28 pages and come to their own conclusions about what this means in terms of the U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia and what should be done about it. So these are dramatic developments. There has been, as the result of these fights, which we have been leading, an emerging leadership of small, precious handful of members of Congress who've broken the go-along-to-get-along pact of cowardice and are emerging as leading patriotic figures. The people who've signed on to Glass-Steagall have done that in the face of enormous pressure not to do it. The people who are taking on the Anglo-Saudi empire directly around 9/11 and around the 28 pages are putting themselves in a position of genuine leadership defending the national security of this country. We've been the catalytic factor in driving all of those events forward over the course of this year. There's things that I know intimately, but I can't discuss publicly about the circumstances around which President Obama was forced to call off at about a minute to midnight the bombing campaign against Syria. We would have been probably on the edge of global war right now if Obama had not been forced to back down from orders that were already issued to launch an attack against Syria back after the August 21st so-called Syrian government chemical weapons attack against the village of Ghouta. We now know that it is a virtual certainty that it was the Saudis, through these jihadist networks, that actually carried that attack out, and that it was another false flag operation aimed at drawing the United States into a war that would have gotten potentially completely out of control. As the result of stopping that, and again, I can just say, Lynn, along with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, along with a number of other individuals, played an absolutely pivotal role in preventing that war from happening, with all of the potential consequent follow-on events. So sometimes, and I think this is a very, very good reminder about what Lynn has warned about, the dangers of sense deception. Because sometimes the most dramatic events are not susceptible to the senses because they're events that were prevented from happening through human intervention rather than events that actually happen. So what we did, the role that we played in the continuous pinning down of Obama and the mobilization against that war in Syria, was pivotal to saving the world from what may have already been thermonuclear extinction. Now, of course, then there's the issue of Obama himself. Beginning in the spring of this year, Obama has been overwhelmed by a succession of scandals, policy failures, and all the rest. And again, let's look at this from the issue of sense certainty. Many people now have come to the view that the two worst things that have happened in recent decades has been Obamacare and the Dodd-Frank bill. Well, go back to 2009, 2010. What did we say about these policies way back then? We said that Obamacare was a replica of the early phases of the Hitler mass death policy back in September, October 1939, when they set up the original euthanasia program that specified categories of people that were lives no longer worth living. We couldn't afford to keep them alive, therefore they had to be disposed of. Well, now people are finding out that under Obamacare, they're going to be denied access to their own doctors. They're going to be denied certain essential medications. We had a report this week that among the medications that are being scaled back in many of these so-called Obamacare-friendly health insurance plans are medications for people with chronic diseases, ranging from high cholesterol, which is completely controllable through medication and diet and things like that, to people who desperately need chemotherapy because they've got various forms of cancer, or people who need medication for HIV. All told, there are 133 million Americans who are taking some form of medication for chronic disease. Those people are all facing life and death issues because many of them are going to be denied access to the full range of medications that they need to survive. So Obama is now more hated as president earlier in his second term in office than any president in history, and that includes Richard Nixon. You've had Benghazi Gate. You've had the IRS scandals. You've had spying on journalists. You've had the whole succession of Snowden revelations. This has been way beyond what happened to George W. Bush after Katrina during the first year of his second term. So this president is closer to impeachment than many people realize. And we've been the driving force. We're the conscience of what there is in the Congress that's salvageable, because they know that back in 2009, when it was not sense certain obvious to the vast majority of people, Lynn said exactly who and what Obama is. Now it's virtually common parlance and common knowledge out on the street. But back in 2009, when we gave Obama the mustache and when Lynn warned that he was a severe narcissist personality like Emperor Nero, we took a whole lot of shit for that, because people did not want to believe it. They wanted to cling to their delusions about Obama. And it was years before the policies that were passed by Congress and set in motion in 2010, namely Obamacare and Dodd-Frank, it was several years before the actual implementation began to be phased in, and now people see the actual hell what's going on. So we've done some amazing things, and not the least of which was the concert that was presented on November 22nd in Vienna, Virginia, with an audience of over 750, 800 people. It was in a sense, a political high point, a high watermark for the year 2013. Nobody else did anything close to what we did to commemorate the memory and mission of John F. Kennedy. The concert was spectacular, and there was a profound impact when, during the break point in the Mozart Requiem, we went instantaneously into a series of excerpts from some of the most powerful speeches by John Kennedy when he was president. It had an enormous impact, and the impact continues to radiate. Members of Congress were stunned when we presented them with the CDs, the DVDs and CDs of that concert. They were stunned that we did it. They were ashamed that nobody else had done it. And it had a profound political impact because it reminded them that there was a time when Congress was a better institution and was more responsive to the actual responsibilities under the Constitution and to the promoting of the general welfare of the country. So we've done some miraculous things, but obviously our agenda is very much unfinished. We're going into the holiday season, and coming out of that, there will be a number of existential issues on the table for this nation and for the world as a whole. We don't have any capacity to forecast at this point a date certain, but we know that the transatlantic financial system is on an absolute death spiral. There is a fight underway, and it's even erupted within the Federal Reserve System. There was obviously a brawl earlier this week, which resulted in the Federal Open Market Committee initiating the tapering off of the quantitative easing, the $85 billion a month bailout of Wall Street and some similar banks in Europe. And we know that Bernanke made a firm pledge to Wall Street. It's a pledge that he has no binding authority to live up to since he's leaving in January. But Bernanke assured Wall Street that the Fed, as part of the tapering, would not sell off any of the toxic assets that they've been purchasing since 2008. And Paul Gallagher made the point that under the quantitative easing bailout policy since September of 2008, $2.2 trillion has been handed over to the Big Six Wall Street banks, and during that same period, they reduced their actual lending into the real economy by $700 billion. So in other words, $3 trillion between the Fed funny money and the investments that they've withheld from the real economy has been accumulated by these banks for their gambling operations and probably to cover massive losses that they've not even publicly owned up to. And furthermore, as the result of that, the entire Federal Reserve System has been completely bankrupted. In 2008, on the eve of the September blowout, the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve System was $800 million. They didn't even have $1 billion in assets, treasury bonds and commercial paper, in their portfolio. Now they've got $4.04 trillion, from $800 million to $4.04 trillion. And at least half of that is toxic paper that they bought off of the banks that's worthless. If the Fed tried to sell that paper off, it would blow out the whole system. So this system in the transatlantic region is absolutely doomed, and the only alternative is Glass-Steagall. Increasingly, people know that. Look, there was a meeting at the White House just before the release of the Volcker rules, after the 5 regulatory agencies were bullied into signing off of them. And Jack Lew, the Treasury Secretary, candidly told the president the Volcker rules stink And if you think that this is going to stop the momentum for Glass-Steagall, it's likely to have the opposite effect. And he said, we better think about something else. If you don't want Glass-Steagall, this ain't going to do the trick. So we're going to have to come up with some kind of better version of Glass-Steagall Light that's really not Glass-Steagall. Obama, who's in a psycho rage state, blew up and kicked Lou out of the meeting. So this issue is on the table right now, and it's an issue that is going to come up again and again until we win this fight. And 2014 is the time frame in which we've got to win it. And it's as simple as that. Now, you've got developments in Eurasia that are extraordinary and really, again, reflect the fact that major governments around the world have gone back to Lynn and Helga's concept of the Eurasian land bridge and are adopting that as a long-term strategic policy, but things are moving right now in that direction. The reason that you've got a crisis in the Ukraine right now is because the Ukraine has been targeted for more than a decade as the key play to make against Russia. The Russians know that. The Ukrainians are now starting to figure this out as well. And so the issue of the Ukraine and the European Union is actually a military strategic issue, because the Russians know that had Ukraine been successfully drawn into the orbit of the European Union, it would have meant the death of the Ukraine, and the spillover into Russia would have been deadly. It's no coincidence that the Vice Prime Minister Rogozin, who has been Russia's liaison to NATO for a long time, came out this week and said that in response to the new U.S. military doctrine of prompt global strike, meaning that the United States can launch a military attack against any target anywhere in the world in a matter of hours, that Russia is prepared to reinforce and modernize and upgrade their own nuclear deterrent capability. They say any action, whether it's conventional or nuclear, coming out of this concept of prompt global strike will result in a nuclear response from Russia. The Chinese, similarly, are basically saying that they will respond potentially with nuclear force in retaliation against what the United States is doing under this doctrine of air-sea battle, which is a threatened first strike doctrine against China. You have a hair-trigger situation now on the Korean Peninsula with the events of the last several weeks there, where the head of state of North Korea, Kim Jong-un, had his uncle and a whole coterie of people around him summarily executed last week. We don't have a clear reading, neither does U.S. government intelligence, and maybe not even fully the Chinese, about what exactly is going on internally in North Korea. But it is a hair-trigger situation that could lead to an escalation into strategic confrontation. And of course, even though we avoided war in Syria in September, and Kerry, working with Lavrov and the Chinese, succeeded in getting an interim deal with Iran around the whole P5+1 talks, these are very fragile, and there are forces that are very much committed to sabotaging it. Now, ultimately, what we are dealing with is an existential showdown with a system of Anglo-Dutch oligarchical power whose primary objective is a massive population reduction from in the range of 7 billion people down to 1. And if you look at what's happened in Cyprus, if you look at what's going on in Greece, in Portugal, in Spain, if you look at what's going on in Detroit, Michigan, you see that the body counts are already there. people are facing death because of austerity measures. I first joined this organization back in 1971-72 because Mr. LaRouche traveled around the country warning that the policies coming out of the IMF, the World Bank, after the end of the Bretton Woods system were a revival of Schachtian economics, Hitlerian economics, and that it would be done by multilateral agencies with a liberal facade, what some people called fascism with a democratic face. So here we are. We've arrived at a certain existential moment of truth where they're trying desperately to move ahead with those policies at a point that their power is in some respects at its weakest point in a very, very long time. And that's due to what we've been able to accomplish and what we're continuing to do. So I think that's where things stand. It's a very, very precarious moment, but one in which there is also cause for optimism and confidence that if we do our job right and continue to make the kinds of groundbreaking advances this coming year that we've made over the course of 2013, that we can bring Obama down, we can win Glass-Steagall, and we can usher in an era of strategic collaboration for a global renaissance involving the leading collaborating powers of the Trans-Pacific region, the United States, China, Russia, India, Japan, South Korea, and others. So we're on the cusp of a potential great victory, and you've got a dying beast, an oligarchical system that understands the precarious situation that they are in, and they will fight to their last dying breath to preserve their system. So we've got a hell of a fight on our hands, but it's a winnable fight, and it's the only fight worth having at this point in history.